Situated on the southern point of the Straits of Mackinaw in Michigan lies the city of Mackinaw with its historic fort and parks. The site was settled by the French in 1673, who set up a trading post in the area. Later this became Fort Mackinaw. With our daughter Linda at the wheel, we approached from the north, crossing the Mackinac Straits on what is said to be one of the longest and strongest suspension bridges in the world. Designed by David Steinman and opened to vehicular traffic in 1957, the bridge measures 2,543 metres between the main anchorages, and its 1,158 metre main span is stiffened by a truss 13 metres deep.
Riding up the cables.
Entering the historic site of Old Mill Creek, we noticed a considerable amount of literature available on the history of this area. The park here was opened in 1975. Inside the entrance stood an old water wheel of the type used in the old timber mill. A guide gathered a group of sightseers together for a tour of the abundant flora in the park.
Very flexible. So if there's anything you need to ask questions about, please do so. It's mixed in with a bunch of other things.
We were warned to be careful of poison ivy in the undergrowth.
But it's not poison ivy. Poison ivy is all right in here. Right underneath my boot here. I'm going to step on with the bottom of my shoe because that way I'm just not even going to end up with it. But that's the poison ivy right there.
As we moved along the trail, our attention was directed to the many and varied types of vegetation beside the pathway.
And then the beak coming off of it.
Many forms of plant life were singled out for our attention along the way. Finding ourselves at a small lookout, we paused to look down at a small lake fed by the creek which flowed from the marsh above. This creek supplied the power to drive a sawmill, which we were to visit shortly. It is possible to brew tea from the leaves of this plant. Our guide pointed to a balsam tree beside the pathway in the forest. Another species of tree in the park is the white spruce. These trees, together with fir trees, commonly dominate the higher altitudes. An aspen tree, with its white bark and shimmering leaves, towered over our heads.
A woodpecker was intent on finding a lunch of larvae or insects from below the bark on this tree. As they basked on the rocks in a small stream on the valley floor, little green frogs were taking advantage of the shade from the trees. Robert Campbell, a Scot, set up a water-powered sawmill at this place in the 1780s. He also worked the forest and farmed the land successfully. Many years later, it eventually became uneconomic and faded into obscurity. Archaeologists commenced excavating the area in the 1970s, and the timber cutting methods of Campbell's mill are reproduced today at this reconstructed mill site.
An axeman demonstrates the method used in the 18th century to dress logs into squared posts and
Just
beams.
cut a notch in the bark. This is going to loosen the inner and the outer layer of the bark. Rather than talking to you more about it, just show you how it's done.
The broad axe was then applied to pare the bark away.
This allows whoever's handling the axe to get in close to the wood that they're working on. If you lay the
With a little help from a youth in the crowd, we were given a demonstration of pit sawing.
Now again, ladies and gentlemen, this is a two-man saw operation. The man on the top is called the tillerman. Just like a tiller on a boat, he's going to help steer the saw to make a straight cut. The man on the bottom is called the pitman. He's going to be in the pit. Now, something I neglected to tell you about the pitman, who's going to be doing all that work? Pitman. Who's going to be getting the sawdust shower?
The pitman.
The pitman. All right. We're going to pull it out here and start a new cut. Right there. And your job as the pitman is only to pull down, okay? Go for it. All right. Okay. Good job. You want a job here? You don't care. How about 12 to 14 hours of this? 12 to 14 hours a day resulted in 12 to 14 boards.
Yeah, it makes
If you
the
slacked
muscle.
off at all, the tillerman may have had the habit of the day of chewing tobacco.
Sit right in that ball.
Ready to stop?
Tobacco
All right. You make me tired just watching. We're gonna move it out.
Over a period of time, the pit saw gave way to the frame saw. Powered by water-driven wheels, this method significantly increased production from the mill.
This is what's going to happen. I'm going to turn this wheel, and in that crib is a gate, and the gate is going to open up, and the water is going to come out of that gate, and it's going to splash onto the paddles of a wheel that we call the flutter wheel, that's at the bottom of the crib. It's going to start spinning that. Now attached to the right-hand side of that is a crank and a long pole that we call the pitman arm. Now who was our pitman out here? You were?
Once the crib gate is opened, water in the sluiceway turns the flutter wheel driving the saw. The logs are pulled through the saw by the pitman arm, driven by a horizontally rotating wheel.
At the back of the mill, we were able to see the sluiceway from the creek, bringing the water into the crib. Moving to the other side of the mill, we had a demonstration of the wheels working under the power of the water. As the crib gate was opened, the force of the falling water supplied the power to the wheels, which in turn drove the sawing process. Adjacent to the mill were several dressed logs. Portion of a building displayed the method of dovetail construction used to construct these log cabins back in the historic times the old mill creek was in operation.
Long before Europeans arrived, the native people referred to this peninsula as Pequodinongi, the headland. Recreated along the shore is a small encampment representing the way these people lived in the 1700s. This domed structure, known as a wagon's gun, was a more permanent structure of the Anishinaabe Indians of the 1700s. The Anishinaabe people often left these frames standing in their more permanent locations and transported the rolls of covering bark or mats from place to place.
The French were interested in acquiring furs from the Indians, and in 1715 built a fort at Mackinaw as a trading centre with the Ottawa Indians. By this time the British also were present in the locality, and a conflict between these two powers eventually led to the fort being taken over by the British in 1760. In the confines of the fort, many local residents today take part in the reenactment of these historic times. The authentically reconstructed fort is a National Historic Landmark. The buildings all house memorabilia of the days the fur traders from France and England came to trade in this land.
A vegetable garden in the grounds of the fort is a reminder that there was a domestic side to the fortifications. An archaeological dig continues in the grounds of the fort, turning up many artefacts of the fort's 60-odd years of existence. A parcel of land beyond the walls of the fort houses a small farm as it was in the 1700s. Several times each day, an exhibition of musket firing is carried out in the grounds of the fort.
Prison forward, put the hammer on half. Reach into my cartridge box, get out a cartridge. Everything I need to load and fire at once in 15 seconds is contained within. 125 grains of black powder, the paper will act as a water. Hold it all in place. Minus the musket bulb. It is 3/4 of an inch diameter. Weighs between an ounce and a quarter, an ounce and a half. 75 caliber. Very big. Cut your fire line. Set your fire line. Yeah, fire! Turn the arrow. Cut your fire line. Set your fire line. Yeah, fire! Right detachment dismissed.
The market for fish was good back in those days, and the local Indians traversed much of the shoreline around here, plying this lucrative trade.
Generally came here for the abundant fishing. There were lake trout and whitefish, but weighed sometimes as much as 70 pounds that could be caught right here in northern Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. We not only fished here in the Straits, but we fished about 50 miles north of here in the rapids of the St. Mary's River. Severe winter weather set in. We traveled some 200 to 250 miles by birch bark canoe.
In period costume, a local resident interested us with tales of the way trading was done between the Indians and the Europeans.
Men, women, boys, and girls all had these beaver felt hats. There were different styles for everyone.
The items traded were many and varied: beads, tobacco and knives, to name a few.
They would trade beads like these ones, or the kind I have on. Natives were also getting new flintlock muskets, so things like flints that they'd use for their guns and muskets.
The Indians had no metal items prior to the arrival of the French and British, and they were very keen to trade for
Actually,
these goods.
Axe heads, armbands, knives. Very important because before European contact, natives didn't have any metal items.
Washing clothes was carried out in wooden tubs and scrubbed against wooden scrubbing boards, which was very wearing on the garments. The water was carted in wooden buckets slung from a yoke across the shoulders. Lye soap was used for washing at that time.
but it's made out of lye, which is a chemical made from the ashes of the fireplace. It's a pretty harsh chemical. There's some lard in here, which is animal fat, and there's some water also.
Human power was needed to stir the washing machine paddle.
I look a little familiar if you've ever looked inside the modern day washing machine. It's exactly what this thing is in the middle, except for it's powered by a person instead of the machine. Okay, and then we're going to string it out.
Entering a British trader's house, we were given an insight into the way the British were accommodated at the fort in the late 1700s. In a newly established air-conditioned exhibition centre below ground level, we found hundreds of items on display unearthed from the archaeological dig being carried out in the fort. Displayed also is an old French well, uncovered below this building during the excavations.
Another room contained displays of the type of ammunition used in the old muskets and cannons of those days. History records that a small cottage industry developed here at that time, producing musket balls and rupert shot for the Indian trade.
A selection of firearms and weapons of the 1700s was displayed in glass showcases. The French soldiers carried marine model muskets made at the Tulle Armoury, and this display typifies those used during the French and Indian Wars. Leaving the fort late that afternoon, we paused for a demonstration of cannon firing, and this brought to a conclusion our visit to these historic sites of Mackinaw.
After that, I'm gonna wet swab it. Note also any burning embers left from the last fire. After that, I'll dry swab it, sucking up all that substance I like to call ick with the black powder water. After that, I'll write down my 7 pound of black powder wrapped in my totally authentic Reynolds wrap. The 1700s, it would have actually been wrapped in linens, a lot like what my breeches are made out of. Next, I'm gonna have to light this can, or actually I have to make the fuse. To make the fuse, I'm gonna use a smaller grain of gunpowder, a lot like what I use in my musket. Right, now those sparks.
Everything at the fort was authentically reconstructed, even to the use of a flint and tinderbox to light the cannon fuse.